Early on the morning of March 6, 1963, 34-year-old Carol Thompson leaned toward the kitchen window of her big brick house on Hillcrest Avenue. In Minnesota, winters were long and cold, and Carol knew the snow she saw falling over the backyard wasn't heavy enough to mean that school would be canceled that day. But before Carol turned her attention back to the counter, where she was getting lunches packed for her 4 kids, she closed her eyes and thought about the trip she'd just taken a few months ago to the Minnesota Museum of American Art. The scene outside reminded her of one of the paintings she'd seen there, and a second later, all Carol wanted was to be back at that museum, not just looking at the painting, but also standing next to the man who had taken her there. Absent-mindedly, Carol began twisting the gold wedding band on her left ring finger. It wasn't her husband, Cotton Thompson, who she'd gone to the museum with. It was a man that Cotton had hired to do some work on the Thompson house more than a year ago. Carol and Cotton just called him by his nickname, Big Red. The tall, handsome, and red-haired door and window salesman had taken an immediate and obvious liking to Carol. And even after the work in the Thompson house was done, Big Red and Carol had kept in touch. Carol's husband, Cotton, who was a criminal defense attorney in downtown St. Paul, was so busy with his law practice that sometimes Carol felt forgotten, and so she had enjoyed Big Red's attention and harmless flirting. So, whenever Big Red was working in the Thompsons' upper-class neighborhood, with all the expensive Tudor-style homes with their gabled windows and exposed timber beams, Big Red would make a point to stop by the house to visit Carol. Big Red would go on strolls in the park with her, and even drove her and the 4 Thompson kids out to the family's summer home on Forest Lake, north of St. Paul. But those visits had stopped a few months ago after Cotton had become furious to find them talking and laughing together in the backyard one afternoon when he came home unexpectedly from work. Now, as Carol stood at the window, she looked down at her hands and saw what she was doing with her wedding band, and she gave herself a mental shake. It was true that Carol had been disappointed when Cotton had told Big Red to stay away from her, but as she reminded herself, Big Red had never posed any real threat to her marriage. In fact, Carol had actually been a bit thrilled to see Cotton's show of jealousy, and she had definitely enjoyed the extra attention Cotton had been paying to her ever since that backyard face-off. Besides, everything that Carol had ever really wanted in life was right here, under the roof of the 2.5-story home that Cotton had redecorated just for her, right down to the custom rugs and the color of the brand new appliances. And best of all, Carol finally had the chance to finish her college degree after 13 years at home raising their 4 kids. Turning to the kitchen counter, Carol took a deep breath, then focused her attention on the familiar tasks that made up her morning routine. With military precision, she laid out the peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and fruit for the 3 Thompson girls to take to the local elementary school, and the apple that her 13-year-old son always brought to middle school. Carol had just finished packing the kids' brown bag lunches when she heard the familiar sound of Cotton's footsteps as he came down the stairs. And by the time the farm boy and Navy veteran strolled into the kitchen, Carol was already smiling. And that smile got even wider when her 36-year-old husband didn't stop until he was close enough that Carol could smell his aftershave. As she turned to face Cotton, he gave her a warm kiss on the lips. When Cotton finally stepped away, the connection between husband and wife felt like it was as strong as it had been 14 years ago when Carol had first met Cotton at Macalester College. Carol had been studying Russian literature at the small, prestigious college. Cotton was 2 years ahead of her, and he was finishing his degree in economics. Cotton had an easy charm and could make people laugh, but he also had serious ambition. He wanted to be a respected and financially successful lawyer, and he had the drive to achieve those goals. They married within a year of meeting each other, and by then, Cotton had already decided that this smart, passionate woman who adored books and art was a partner he would love and cherish for the rest of his days. The two wasted no time starting a family. Carol was pregnant just a few months after the wedding. And now, looking at Cotton, Carol thought about how little he had changed. Even though Cotton's hair was still wet from a morning bath, the water hardly even darkened the color. A blonde so white that her husband had been called Cotton ever since he was a boy. Cotton knew that his wife had been annoyed when he had told Big Red that he was no longer welcome at their home. But Cotton was smart enough to know that Carol was an extremely attractive woman with her dark curly hair and easy smile, and all Big Red's interest in Carol had really done was to remind Cotton not to fall into the trap of taking his wife for granted. Cotton wanted to get home from work in time to watch the kids, so Carol could make it to school that evening. Cotton had a late meeting that day that could delay him, but he promised Carol he'd move it if he had to. He hated when she had to miss a class because of him. And also, there was another reason Cotton didn't want to stay late at work tonight. He was nervous to leave Carol home alone. Just a week earlier, everyone in St. Paul had been totally shocked by the murder of a 15-year-old high school student who had been stabbed and beaten to death. Her schoolmate had confessed to the killing just 3 days later, but the sheer brutality of the crime had put everyone in the Thompsons' neighborhood on edge. As Cotton stepped out the door with their son, he told Carol he'd give her a call sometime this morning to check in and let her know when he'd be able to get home that night. They gave each other a final kiss, and then Carol watched Cotton and Jeff disappear into the falling snow. About an hour later, as Carol was vacuuming the upstairs bedrooms, she heard the telephone ring. As she turned off the vacuum and headed downstairs to answer it, she wished that they had a second phone up in their master bedroom. Picking up the receiver in the kitchen, Carol heard Cotton's upbeat voice at the other end of the line. His secretary had apparently changed his schedule, so he would be home in time for Carol to go to her evening class. By the time Carol was off the phone and heading back upstairs to put the vacuum cleaner away, she decided that with a late night ahead of her, maybe she'd just take a break from cleaning and go back to bed. But once Carol was inside the master bedroom, she heard a sound that she didn't recognize coming from somewhere in the house. She held her breath for a second and just listened intently. Carol suddenly missed their little dog, Shotzi, who was a terribly behaved dachshund, whose bad habits included barking at everything that moved. They had just recently gotten rid of him because he chewed up all their carefully redecorated furniture. As Carol strained her ears to hear the sound again, she couldn't hear anything. The house was totally quiet. But Carol was still very much on edge. So when she heard the sound again a minute later, she leapt out of her bed, walked up to the door, and opened it to see what was going on. And when she did, she saw there was someone standing right there. Carol had no time to think. Adrenaline flooding her body, she started to fight for her life. "10 minutes later, just after 9 a.m., 3 houses east of the Thompson house, the bell rang. Ruth Nelson left her breakfast nook to answer the door. But before she got there, the bell rang again. So Ruth hustled the last few steps and opened the door, expecting to chew out a salesman for being so pushy. But instead, she saw a woman standing there, barefoot and dressed only in a blood-soaked blue bathrobe. Blood was streaming from cuts on her scalp and face. It took Ruth a moment to recognize that this was her neighbor and friend, Carol Thompson. Carol, as she looked at Ruth, she grabbed at her throat, and Ruth noticed there was something metal protruding from it. And then, in a hoarse voice, barely above a whisper, Carol begged Ruth for help. Ruth and her husband quickly helped Carol into their home, and Ruth asked Carol over and over again, "Who did this to you?" And Carol just looked at her friend and forced out a few words. She said, quote, "A man came to my house." And then Carol collapsed on the rug. A police officer and a sergeant were just a few blocks away, sitting in their squad car when they heard the dispatch call at 9:07 a.m. that morning. They arrived at the Nelson home first, where they found the victim, Carol, lying on the floor. Her eyes were open, but she couldn't speak. The doctor who lived across the street had rushed over to help when his wife saw Carol staggering down the street, and the doctor was putting pressure on Carol's most serious wounds. The police officers immediately called for help, and they would discover that the ambulance was actually already on its way. And so just a couple of minutes later, the paramedics arrived, they loaded Carol into the ambulance, and they sped off with her. Meanwhile, Ruth's adult son, who was close to Cotton's age and had known him for years, volunteered to make the difficult call to Cotton's law office. He walked slowly to the phone, took a deep breath, and then dialed. When he got Cotton on the line, he would tell him that his wife had been in some sort of accident and was now being taken to nearby Anchor Hospital. As the sirens of a half a dozen arriving police cars wailed, the 2 police officers who had responded first to the scene went 3 doors down to the Thompsons' house. The first thing they noticed were fresh footprints in the snow covering the brick walkway that ran from the front door to the sidewalk. Prints that could have belonged to a family member or perhaps the assailant. The two policemen could also see that the front storm door was closed, but the inner door was open, indicating that the killer, or someone, had left in a hurry. They walked around the footprints, careful not to disturb them, as they peered inside the home. When they saw a puddle of blood on the entryway floor, they decided to wait for those squad cars to arrive before going any further. Within minutes, Detective George Barkley pulled up at the Thompson house, along with several officers of the St. Paul Police Department, where the 50-year-old detective had served for 25 years. Barkley adjusted his fedora hat as he stepped out of the car. The officers on scene told him they found that front door wide open and the side door to the house was unlocked. Detective Barkley knew that if either door had been left unlocked, then that really meant just about anyone could have entered the house and done this. Detective Barkley drew his gun and then led the officers inside the home, being very mindful that the killer could still be in the house. But after searching every room in the house, they discovered that the house was clear. There was no one else there. Barkley headed back upstairs. The kids' bedrooms were undisturbed, but the master bedroom was totally ransacked. Barkley wondered if this was maybe a robbery gone wrong. Maybe a burglar was surprised to find Carol home, and they attacked her. That would explain the chaos inside the house. But there were some things about the crime scene that didn't fit the robbery theory. They didn't really fit any coherent theory at all. As Barkley walked through the house, he just felt more and more confused by the evidence he was seeing. For some reason, the tub in the bathroom was filled with about 6 inches of lukewarm water. There was no indication that Carol had been bathing at the time of the attack. There were also smears of blood on the sink and floor, along with a 14-inch length of thick rubber hose. Clearly, the detective thought, the robber must have brought the hose, but for what reason, he didn't know. In a pool of blood near the bathroom, investigators also found pieces of black and white plastic, the broken handle to a gun. Detective Barkley tracked signs of a struggle, which began upstairs and continued downstairs. Carol's fight for her life appeared to have climaxed somewhere between the front entrance to the house and the kitchen. The kitchen was totally smeared with blood, a drawer had been yanked open, and several knives had been pulled out of a tray. The drawer and the linoleum floor were also spotted red. Barkley's men eventually found a pool of blood in the front entrance, and they also found 3 live bullets on the floor. If the robber had a gun, Barkley thought, why had they stabbed Carol so many times instead of just shooting her? And finally, there was the strange question of what, if anything, had actually been stolen. From what Barkley could tell, the house was trashed, but there were pieces of jewelry and other obviously expensive items laying around. At the front entrance, sitting in a pool of blood, they even found a small woman's ring with a cluster of stones in the shape of a heart. And so if this was a robbery, it had been a very unsuccessful one. As Detective Barkley and his team examined the inside of the house, other officers canvassed the neighborhood. For everyone else on the block, it had been a totally normal Wednesday morning, with people beginning their commutes to work and getting their kids off to school. But when police spoke to all the neighbors, nobody had seen anything out of the ordinary. Carol's next-door neighbor had called Carol at 9 a.m., just about the time that Carol was getting attacked. When Carol didn't answer the phone, the neighbor actually peered into her bedroom window to see if she was home, but the neighbor said she didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Whoever attacked Carol had clearly managed to do it without attracting any attention at all, which was hard to do in such a close-knit neighborhood. That suggested to the police that her assailant was not just a crazed person roaming the streets and breaking into homes at random. Whoever assaulted Carol was clearly smart and efficient enough to get away quickly and quietly. As long as they were free, the public could still be in danger. At 10:30 a.m., so an hour and a half after the attack on Carol, the St. Paul Police Department's crime lab team arrived and began dusting for fingerprints, hoping the assailant left his mark. Neighbors peered out of windows, watching the men in overcoats and galoshes standing in the falling snow, taking notes, and snapping photographs. Police also discovered blood droplets and smears tracing Carol's path to various neighbors' houses as she ran around trying to get help. The criminologist followed Carol's footprints out the side door and around the back of her house to the house immediately to the east, and red smears indicated that Carol had rung the bell and pounded on the door and then gone to the next house over before she stumbled to Ruth's house at the corner. Nearby, at Anchor Hospital, where Carol had been taken by the ambulance, her husband, Cotton, sat in the waiting room sobbing while a team of doctors desperately tried to save Carol's life. When Carol had been brought in, she had no pulse. She lost a lot of blood, mainly from the knife wounds in her neck and scalp, and she had lots of cuts on her arms and hands. Carol had clearly fought back hard. There was a 3-inch blade stuck in Carol's throat. The surgeons had removed it, and they performed a procedure called a tracheotomy, which is when doctors cut a hole directly into a person's throat from the outside to help them breathe. But Carol's heart was barely beating, so the doctors put manual pressure on her heart to try to jumpstart it. Doctors also drilled a hole in Carol's skull to remove any blood that might have pooled inside of her head from all the blows she had taken. But ultimately, Carol's injuries proved to be too severe. And at 12:58 p.m. on March 6, 1963, 4 hours after Carol stumbled down her block looking for help, the doctors pronounced her dead. The violent assault had now become a murder investigation for the St. Paul police, and homicides in this Midwestern city were very rare. St. Paul saw an average of just 6 a year. But one of those murders had just taken place 6 days before Carol's, the beating and stabbing of a 15-year-old schoolgirl only 2 miles from the Thompsons' home. There were some similarities between the two deadly assaults, but Detective Barkley helped put that killer behind bars 3 days before Carol was killed. The schoolgirl killing resolved quickly, but it unsettled the residents of Carol's and Cotton's fashionable Highland Park neighborhood, where there had only been a couple of homicides since the end of World War II, 18 years before, and it put a lot of pressure on Detective Barkley to solve this case fast. At the hospital, Detective Barkley spoke to Carol's grief-stricken husband. Cotton would say that Carol had been in a good mood that morning when he left for work just after 8. He also mentioned calling Carol at 8:30 that morning to tell her he would be able to watch the kids that night so she'd be able to go to school. As a defense attorney, Cotton did understand that the husband would be the number one person of interest at the start of any murder investigation, and he was patient and polite with the barrage of questions from the police. He referred investigators to his secretary, who confirmed that Cotton was indeed at his office at the time of his wife's murder. Cotton would also suggest to Detective Barkley 2 possible theories for this crime. Cotton said that it was possible that one of his former clients might have come to rob him or hurt Carol, but he couldn't think of any actual ex-associates who were disgruntled with him. He offered the police access to his client history, but he said he really didn't think it would lead them to the killer. Then Cotton told the detective his second theory. This one, he said, made much more sense than an angry client. It involved a red-haired window and door salesman that he'd done business with a year earlier. Cotton told detectives that this salesman, named Big Red, developed a clear infatuation with his wife and found every excuse to come to their house to see Carol. Cotton told police that he really didn't like the friendship, quote, that had developed between this man and his wife. Barkley asked Cotton if Carol could have been having an affair with Big Red. Cotton shook his head and said absolutely not. He had seen what was developing between Big Red and his wife, and he had stepped in to put a stop to it before it went any further. Cotton explained that a few months earlier, he had come home unexpectedly in the middle of the afternoon, and he had found Big Red in the backyard talking to his wife, and Cotton had watched them from inside the house, and Big Red had said something that made Carol laugh. Her eyes were sparkling, and then Big Red put a hand on Carol's waist, and at that point, Cotton said he burst out the side door and told Big Red to stay away from his wife and his kids, and they proceeded to get into this big shouting match. Cotton was ready to punch Big Red, but before any fists flew, Big Red ultimately stormed off, and as he left, Big Red vowed that this would not be the last time they saw him. The police would also speak to Carol and Cotton's neighbors on either side of their house to see if they knew anything about this relationship Carol had with Big Red. and the neighbors would say they saw Big Red around, spending time with Carol and the kids, and it just seemed like he was a friend of the family. The neighbors did say, though, that it seemed like Big Red was flirting with Carol, and none could blame him for liking their attractive neighbor. Beneath her horn-rimmed glasses, Carol had this winning smile and quick wit. I mean, she was amazing. And Carol had admitted to her neighbors that she found Big Red very attractive. They both liked art and literature, neither of which held any appeal for Cotton. But Carol swore to whoever she talked to that she and Big Red were just friends. However, whatever the real status of that relationship was, Detective Barkley knew he now had his first good lead. Barkley tracked down Big Red at work that afternoon and drove him to the station. Big Red sat with his head in his hands, sobbing as he answered the detective's questions about his relationship to the Thompson family. He confirmed that he had developed a friendship with Carol after he sold Cotton some windows for their house, and he admitted that after that job was finished, he would swing by to see Carol when he was in the neighborhood. Big Red told police that he had taken Carol to an art museum a couple of times, and once he drove Carol and the kids to their summer home, but he was adamant that he had had nothing to do with Carol's death. He told Barkley that after his backyard altercation with Cotton, he dropped his friendship with Carol altogether. Big Red figured that it would be best for him to stay away. He said he hadn't seen Carol since the dust-up with Cotton, and at 9 a.m. on March 6th, when Carol was attacked, Big Red said he was at a sales conference, which his boss would back up. And so, this case was clearly not going to wrap up as fast as Detective Barkley hoped, and the police department was really starting to feel the heat. News of Carol's murder sent shockwaves through the Highland Park and larger Twin Cities communities. A home invasion in that exclusive neighborhood was unthinkable, and the victim, an all-American housewife and mother of 4, was well known in the community and universally adored. To imagine such a woman meeting such a brutal end shook people to the core, and the killer, whoever they were, was still out there. Nervous housewives peered out of their windows, refusing to answer the door for deliveries or door-to-door salesmen, and husbands began coming home early from work every night. In a town that rarely saw a locked door, chain locks were now flying off the shelves of hardware stores. Sporting goods stores ran out of shotgun shells and pistols and bullets. Public officials demanded results. In response, across the Twin Cities region, police rounded up anyone who could in any way be considered a suspect. Wives turned in abusive husbands, petty thieves and sex offenders were pulled off the street, police hauled in peeping toms, public drunks, and known burglars. They threw homeless men, even the disabled and mentally ill, into squad cars and took them downtown. Anyone that seemed even a little bit different or, quote, suspicious in any way, the police fingerprinted and interrogated. But none seemed connected to the case. As the month of March 1963 ticked away, Detective Barkley was starting to get frustrated. He had no fingerprints and no eyewitnesses. His victim had problems in her marriage, but both her husband and the other man she had gotten close to had very solid alibis. The crime scene looked like a robbery, except nothing had been stolen. The only good evidence he really had was the black and white pieces of plastic laminate that police had found in the entryway of the home and in the upstairs hallway. They were very likely parts of the handle of some kind of gun. Detective Barkley figured if he could just identify the weapon, maybe it could lead him to his killer. So he sent the pieces of plastic off to the FBI for analysis, and then he waited very impatiently for a few weeks, and then finally he got his answer. The plastic pieces were indeed from the grip of a gun. They were from a custom-made pistol grip for a 7.65mm Luger pistol. Detective Barkley felt relief at finally making progress here, and now he was hopeful that this would lead to the break in the case that he so badly needed. And so, on April 5th, 1 month after the murder, Detective Barkley and the St. Paul police chief held a televised press conference. They affixed those customized pieces of the pistol grip onto an identical Luger and displayed images of it in poster-sized photos. Barkley and the police chief blasted these pictures all over the state in hopes that someone would recognize this custom gun and call the police to tell them who it belonged to. In the days following the press conference, Barkley began combing through the numerous tips he had from the public since the murder. and at some point he found an unnamed source claiming that Cotton had taken out $900,000 in life insurance on his wife across 3 carriers, and some of those policies were apparently written as recently as 2 months before the murder. Barkley looked into this claim, and he soon discovered that Cotton had indeed taken out policies, but with 8 carriers totaling $1.1 million, about $10 million in today's dollars. At this time, the average American was making less than $10,000 a year. Investigators spoke to Carol's parents. Her father, who was a successful heating and plumbing contractor in St. Paul, valued his own estate at about $600,000, which would be about $6 million today. Carol, being an only child, was set to inherit all of that money, meaning if she were to die, the family fortune was set to go to her and Cotton and the kids. Detective Barkley started wondering if this, quote, pillar of the community, aka Cotton, was not really the man he presented himself to be. As his investigators spoke to more people in the Thompson circle of friends, he learned that Cotton was often seen around town with other women. Cotton started to look really suspicious to Barkley. But being a bad husband and buying life insurance was not illegal, and Barkley could find no connection between Cotton and the murder weapon. But before Barkley got too deep into his re-examination of Cotton, his press conference about the Luger totally paid off. On April 9th, he received a call from someone claiming that the Luger was actually his. A traveling salesman from Minneapolis told police that his apartment had been burglarized on February 14th, 3 weeks before Carol's murder, and one of the items he reported stolen was that pistol. He had made the customized hand grip in a shop class at a local community college. Detective Barkley confirmed that the salesman was nowhere near St. Paul the day of Carol's murder, and so could not have been her killer. Finally, this felt to Barkley like a really solid lead backed by evidence, but it presented a whole new set of challenges. Now Barkley had to solve a burglary in another city in the hopes that the perpetrator of that crime was also the one who committed this murder. But it wouldn't take long for the police to catch another break. On April 17th, so 8 days after that salesman called to say that Luger was his, 2 masked men burst into a bar in St. Paul, they drew their guns, and demanded the bartender hand over the cash in his till. Then one of the robbers punched the bartender before taking the money and escaping with his accomplice. A few days later, St. Paul police arrested the 2 men on suspicion of burglary and assault. The tavern robbery was the latest of several robberies they had committed in the area. When police got the thieves into interview rooms in the jail, one of the robbers struck a deal with the county and started talking. He had information the police wanted. He knew all about that special Luger the cops were looking for. He and his buddy were the ones who actually stole it. The robber claimed that he had only had the Luger for a month. He told police that 2 weeks before Carol's murder, he had given the gun to a man that he and his accomplice knew. His name was Norman Mastrian. The cops knew Norman too. He was a former champion boxer whose life had gone totally south, and he'd had lots of scrapes with the law. In fact, he was actually a suspect in another murder, but detectives couldn't find enough evidence to charge him. Detective Barkley thought Norman was certainly capable of killing Carol. But the robber told police that Norman was not the last person he had seen with that Luger. The day before Carol got murdered, the robber watched Norman give it to someone else, a guy named Dick W.C. Anderson. And police did some digging, and they discovered that Dick was a Korean War veteran with a Purple Heart. And to get a Purple Heart, it means you got injured in combat. But Dick also had a drinking problem, and he had been through a bitter divorce, and he was now apparently a petty criminal, but it really didn't seem like he was a murderer. And Dick had absolutely no connections to the Thompsons, so why would he kill Carol? It felt like the more clues Detective Barkley and his team found, the more of a mystery this case became. Detective Barkley had no problem finding Norman Mastrian, the former champion boxer, but Dick Anderson, the last one to have the Luger, was another story. Dick had left town in a hurry after seeing Barkley's press conference about the Luger. Detective Barkley put out an all-points bulletin across the country with a description of Dick. It was a long shot, but on May 19th, it paid off. 1,700 miles from St. Paul, police in Phoenix, Arizona entered a cheap motel on an unrelated matter, and they recognized the man who was checking out at the time as Dick Anderson. Police immediately extradited Dick back to Minnesota, and after 3 days in jail, Dick Anderson would confess to everything. And suddenly, all the loose ends and confusing, conflicting pieces of evidence made a terrible kind of sense. The story that Dick had to tell was far more shocking than anything Detective Barkley or any of his colleagues had imagined. Here's what really happened on March 6, 1963, the day Carol Thompson was murdered. Before dawn, Dick Anderson slipped into the Thompson house through the unlocked side door while everyone in the house was asleep. Dick moved silently through the kitchen and headed down to the basement where he waited in the dark. Now, what Dick was doing was not his typical line of work. However, he was broke, and the $3,000 that Norman Mastrian had offered him to do what he was going to do was a lot of money, and so he had agreed to do it. So Dick waited in the darkness of a stranger's basement, periodically glancing at the hand-drawn map he had been given of the home's layout. Dick had also fortified his courage with vodka and amphetamines, and so his heart was racing. The sun rose and Dick listened as just a few feet above his head in the kitchen, Carol got her family fed and out the door. About 20 minutes later, Carol answered the telephone. It was Cotton calling from the office, telling her he'd be home in time for Carol to go to class that evening. Meanwhile, in the basement, Dick grasped the 14-inch length of thick rubber tubing Norman had given him. Dick's plan was to slip into the kitchen and strike Carol on the back of the head with this rubber. He thought a clean blow would totally knock her out. Dick could hear Carol's voice, muffled through the floorboards, as she spoke to her husband. Dick carefully headed up the stairs until one of the wooden steps let out a loud squeak. He heard Carol's voice stop cold. Dick froze and waited to hear Carol resume her phone call. He realized that Carol would hear him coming if he continued up the stairs, so he revised his plan. He would wait in the basement until he was sure Carol had left the kitchen. Eventually, Dick would hear Carol vacuuming on the second floor for several minutes, and then right as he was about to go up, he heard the phone ring again. But this time, Carol did not come downstairs to answer it. She stayed upstairs and let it ring. And so at this point, Dick made his move. He ascended the last few basement steps, he padded through the empty kitchen and climbed the main stairs to the second floor. And as he did this, Carol heard him, and she walked to her bedroom door right as he arrived in front of her bedroom door. And when Carol opened it up, she was totally startled to see this man she had never seen before standing in her house. But before she could scream, Dick told Carol that he was just here to rob her. He promised that if she did what she was told, she would get through this just fine. And so Carol did as she was told, and she laid down face first on the floor, at which point Dick struck her in the back of the head with that thick rubber hose, knocking her out. He then dragged Carol's unconscious body down the second floor landing, leaving her in front of the bathroom door for a moment. Then Dick looked into the bathroom, and he saw water in the bathtub, just as Norman had told him to expect. But as Dick began dragging Carol into the bathroom, Carol woke up, and immediately she began fighting back. Dick, in a panic, pulled out the Luger to shoot her, but the pistol wouldn't fire, and so he just began bashing the pistol into Carol's face. Blood flowed from Carol's forehead, but she just kept on fighting. Dick hit her again and again, hard enough to break off a piece of the gun's white and black plastic laminate grip. Carol eventually managed to separate herself from her attacker, and she scrambled down the stairs, tumbling into the entryway, and she tried to escape out the front door. But Dick caught up to her right as she was struggling to open up the chain latch, and he continued to bludgeon her over and over again with his now broken gun. Another piece of the handle would break off during this beating downstairs, and 3 live rounds would pop out of the gun. At this point, Dick was totally panicking, and he left Carol on the floor moaning in pain, and he ran into the kitchen. There, he rifled through a door and grabbed a 3-inch paring knife to finish Carol off. Dick descended on Carol in the hallway between the kitchen and front entrance and began stabbing her over and over. On the 50th blow, the knife got stuck in Carol's throat, and when Dick tried to pull it out again, the blades snapped off the handle. At this point, Carol finally stopped moving, and Dick climbed off her, marveling at her will to live. But now it was over, and Dick had things to do before getting out of there as fast as he could. Upstairs in the bathroom, Dick turned on the sink and washed the blood off his shaking hands. He then rushed into the neatly kept master bedroom, pulling out drawers, knocking things over to make it look like this was a robbery gone bad. As Dick bounded down the stairs, he didn't notice that Carol was no longer where he had left her, in the short hallway that led to the kitchen. Dick had no clue that as he was heading out the front door, Carol was stumbling down the block looking for help. Dick left the Highland Park neighborhood and connected with Norman. Nothing in their plan had gone as expected. What was supposed to be a bloodless killing had turned into a gory and violent mess. Together, they disposed of the gun in a swampland north of St. Paul, and then when Norman returned to his home, he picked up the phone to make the hardest call of all. At the other end of the line was the man who had plotted Carol's death from the start and actually put up the money to make it happen. This was the one person Carol had loved and trusted since she first met him 14 years ago at Macalester College. It was Carol's husband, Eugene Cotton Thompson, and he had been planning his wife's murder for almost 2 years. Cotton had been in an on-again, off-again affair for 3 years with a woman named Jackie Olson. He met Jackie when he represented her in a divorce. Cotton handled divorces as well as criminal cases. The attractive young mother didn't have the money to pay him, so Cotton got her a job as a stenographer so she could work it off. She'd go to, quote, business dinners with Cotton and out-of-town trips, while Carol stayed home with the kids. Cotton enjoyed his illicit romance, but Jackie wanted to build a life with him. When Cotton balked at leaving Carol and his kids, Jackie said fine, and she married another man. But when Jackie's new relationship hit the rocks fast, Cotton made another play for her. He promised Jackie that they wouldn't have to worry about Carol anymore, and they'd have plenty of money to live on for the rest of their lives. One of the clients that Cotton represented as a defense attorney was an old classmate from Macalester who had had several scrapes with the law, including being roped into an unrelated murder. This person was Norman Mastrian, and Norman didn't have to plan anything. Cotton had that all figured out. A month before the murder, Cotton got rid of the family dog who barked whenever anything came into the house. Cotton had removed the upstairs phone 2 days before the murder, telling Carol he would swap it out for a phone that fit the house's new color scheme. He planned to call Carol on the morning of the murder, which would ensure that she would go into the kitchen, where the only phone left in the house was located. It was here that Cotton planned for Norman to strike her with the rubber hose and knock her out, and then Norman was supposed to carry an unconscious Carol up the stairs to the bathroom where there would be water left in the tub. Cotton did not typically bathe before work, but on the day of the murder, he would. And he'd leave the stopper in the drain so Norman could fill Carol's lungs with the water. Cotton figured they could make it look like Carol slipped in the tub, hit her head, and then drowned in the bathwater. Knowing that the police would be looking at Cotton as their first suspect, he had had an airtight alibi. He'd be at work making phone calls with his secretary. Cotton planned to finger Big Red for the murder. But Cotton's plan unraveled in a few key places. First, Norman Mastrian, despite whatever crimes he had committed up to that point, he couldn't bring himself to actually kill a church-going mother of 4. So he had subcontracted out the actual killing and did not tell Cotton. Norman gave Dick Anderson the same marching orders Cotton had given him. But Dick wanted more than just a piece of rubber tubing with him when he entered the Thompson house, and so he asked Norman for a backup weapon in the form of a gun. Norman then turned to his 2 robber friends who gave him the customized Luger pistol they'd recently stolen when they burglarized an apartment, and Norman gave it to Dick. Cotton could never have anticipated that pieces of a gun he never planned on using during this attack would then lead police to the hitman, who would then confess everything he knew. police arrested Cotton on June 20th, 1963, 2 months after Carol's murder. In November of 1963, just 8 months after the murder, a jury found Cotton Thompson guilty, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison. As for Norman Mastrian, the middleman for the hit, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison, all of which he served, and as for Dick Anderson, the man who actually killed Carol, he would spend almost 2 decades behind bars. It was early March 2004, and Dr. Eugene Malov was a man who had just received very good news. As the scientist headed from his home in Pembroke, New Hampshire, to his small publishing company located just 7 miles away in Concord, he looked out the window of his dark green Dodge Caravan minivan. The narrow local road that would take him to Route 3 and then north to the state's picturesque capital was hemmed in on both sides by a thick border of trees. No matter how many times Eugene made this drive, he was always struck by the natural beauty that surrounded him. And now, as he looked at the postcard perfection of the New Hampshire mountains, forests, and rushing streams, he suddenly felt hopeful that the research he was doing would help preserve the beauty of this environment for generations to come. If his 2 children and his brand new first grandchild were going to enjoy the cool summers and clean air that he'd grown up with, then the United States and the world had to find a power source that was cleaner, cheaper, and safer than burning natural gas or fossil fuels. And Eugene, along with a small handful of other scientists, was absolutely positive that he already knew what that power source was: cold fusion. Also known as low-level nuclear reaction, cold fusion is a revolutionary way to create unlimited energy by forcing a nuclear reaction to take place at room temperature and under normal pressure. It's actually the same kind of reaction that triggers the energy released by the explosion of an atomic bomb. The very good news that Eugene had read that morning was in an email from a high-profile science writer saying that the U.S. Department of Energy had finally agreed to review all the research and evidence supporting cold fusion as a viable energy alternative that should be funded and studied at the government level. Although the upcoming review was not yet public knowledge, Eugene knew that the implications were potentially huge, because up to that point, cold fusion was mostly ridiculed as being a foolish idea straight out of a science fiction novel. But now, if the government stamped their approval on cold fusion, it would totally disrupt the world energy production industry. And more specifically, it would cost jobs and money for a lot of people who worked or invested in fossil fuels. The concept of cold fusion had first made public headlines back in 1989 when 2 electrochemists working at the University of Utah claimed to have discovered the chemical process that led to cold fusion. And for a while, it was the breakthrough in energy research that everyone, including Eugene, was buzzing about. But when no one else could replicate the scientists' results, it didn't take long before people began accusing the electrochemists of faking their results, that cold fusion was just a hoax. But over the years, after reviewing all the science and data, Eugene had gone from being a member of the mainstream cold fusion skeptics club to conducting his own experiments and research that convinced him that cold fusion was possible. In fact, as far as Eugene was concerned, cold fusion was not just a theory. It was a scientific certainty that would transform people's lives and save the planet from global warming. And, especially with the U.S. Department of Energy review adding to his credibility, Eugene knew that he had the brilliance and academic pedigree to totally back up his claim that cold fusion was not just a crazy pipe dream. Back when he was just 23 years old, Eugene had earned both an undergraduate and advanced degree in aeronautical and astronautical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This college, which is known more commonly by its acronym, MIT, is one of the top science universities in the world. 5 years later, he'd graduate from Harvard, another top-ranked university also located in Cambridge, Mass., with a doctorate in environmental health sciences. But to his friends and his family, Eugene had never been known as a straight-laced, boring academic. While he did love to talk endlessly about his latest experiments in global warming and cold fusion, he also had a totally zany sense of humor and a big personality to boot that often made him the life of any party he attended. Eugene's interest in science extended far beyond the laboratory. He didn't just research the development of new energies, he wrote about the futuristic ways they could be applied. When he was 34, he co-authored a paper about using solar sails to travel to Alpha Centauri, the star closest to the sun. And as a science journalism teacher at both MIT and Boston University, Eugene was popular for his ability to teach students how to turn dry, technical, and scientific findings into language that could capture the public's interest and imagination. In fact, in 1987, because of his acclaim as a scientist who was also a gifted writer, MIT offered Eugene the job of becoming the university's national and local media contact for MIT research, and the chief science writer and director in charge of reporting on all MIT research for the MIT University newspaper, Tech Talk. And during all that time, Eugene continued focusing his energy and genius on what had become his personal crusade, exploring and understanding cold fusion. So 4 years later, in 1991, it did not come as a big surprise to his fellow scientists and colleagues when Eugene published a book on cold fusion that was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, one of the most coveted awards in literature. What did surprise the scientific community was Eugene's decision, also in 1991, to resign from his high-paying job at MIT and to accuse the prestigious university of deliberately hiding cold fusion data so it could protect its reputation and its funding for more conventional nuclear fusion research. After leaving MIT, Eugene totally embraced his new role as an outsider, a highly respected and credentialed scientist and writer who challenged his more traditional and mainstream colleagues to push the limits of invention and theory. He began working as a consultant to U.S. corporations and investment firms doing research and development in cold fusion. In late 1994, he founded his own magazine called Infinite Energy, and with the money from an anonymous donor, he also set up his own nonprofit organization called New Energy Foundation that built a laboratory for testing new technologies. In 1998, Eugene was the technical advisor for the Hollywood thriller The Saint that centers around the theft of a newly discovered formula for cold fusion. Now, in 2004, as Eugene drove along the beautiful New Hampshire country roads, he was known not only for his brilliance and unconventional career path, but for his outspoken and sometimes combative criticism of big oil and the mainstream energy science community. As Eugene turned right onto New Hampshire Route 3, the narrow highway that would take him the rest of the way to his office in Concord, he'd already decided on the headline for the article he'd be writing for the May-June issue of his magazine, Infinite Energy. It would read, U.S. Department of Energy commits to re-examine cold fusion, 15 years of evidence for low-energy nuclear reactions. After pulling into a parking space out front of his magazine headquarters, Eugene hopped out of his car and headed inside where he celebrated this victory with his little 4-person staff. Over the next few weeks, Eugene put off everything else in his life so he could work exclusively on the article for the next issue of Infinite Energy. And only when it was finished did he really turn his attention to another totally separate personal problem that had been coming to a head over the last several months. Back in the spring of 2003, a little more than 1 year before the review of cold fusion was announced, Eugene's parents were ready to sell their house in Norwich, Connecticut, where Eugene had grown up. Eugene's dad had been a plumber, and his mom had been a math teacher, and then once they retired, they moved away from Norwich. And for more than a year, the white craftsman-style home on Salem Turnpike in the middle of the old mill town in eastern Connecticut had been sitting vacant. But Eugene, who was an only child, had very fond memories of the house with its arched windows and doorway. He'd spent hours when he was young lying out in the backyard of that house, looking up at the stars while he imagined scenes from the hundreds of science fiction books he loved to read. So he persuaded his parents not to sell the property, but to rent it out instead. This way, they could keep the place that held so many happy memories, and Eugene, who said he would manage the property for a small fee, could pull in some much-needed extra income. Ever since Eugene had left his high-paying job at MIT to focus on his magazine and foundation, money had become tight, especially in the last year when his fundraising efforts had fallen short and he'd been forced to shut down the research lab at Infinite Energy and lay off 3 of his lab technicians. Eugene had even gotten his own real estate license to help cover family expenses and keep his magazine afloat, but it still just wasn't really enough. And so this rental property opportunity was a lot more than just nostalgia. This was a big financial opportunity for Eugene and his wife of 34 years, Joanne. So in May of 2003, Eugene's first tenants at his family's home moved in, Patricia and Roy Anderson. And at first, everything was great. Then, in January and February of 2004, the couple missed paying their rent. As a licensed real estate broker, Eugene knew that he could have started eviction proceedings within 2 weeks of non-payment. But Eugene and his parents did not want to just kick the couple and their 26-year-old son off the property unless that was their absolute only option. But after months of sending the tenants dozens of legal notices that rent was due and never hearing a word back, the matter unfortunately went to mediation, which is when a neutral third party steps in and helps the 2 sides resolve their issues. Eugene and the tenants would eventually work out an agreement that gave the Andersons until mid-April 2004 to move out of the house. And, true to their word, the Andersons would leave on time, and they would move into a new apartment about 20 minutes away. But despite getting the property back, Eugene knew that it was not ready to be rented out again. Soon, he would have to get over there and make some repairs and do some lawn work and remove some belongings that the Andersons appeared to have just left behind. But for now, with the May-June issue of Infinite Energy finally out on the newsstands, Eugene, who had not had a day off in weeks, decided to take a little break from his responsibilities. So he and Joanne arranged to take a short vacation and go to Seattle, Washington to visit their newly born first grandchild. This flexibility was one of the things that Eugene had enjoyed the most since leaving MIT. He missed the big paycheck, but really, Eugene had never been much of a 9-to-5 company man. Still strong and in good shape, with receding but still thick dark hair, a graying beard, and glasses, Eugene threw himself into physical work and social get-togethers with the same energy that he brought to conducting cold fusion experiments in the basement of his New Hampshire home. His wife, Joanne, was just as outgoing and sociable as her husband, so they were both excited about seeing their daughter and son-in-law, meeting the new grandbaby, and exploring the largest city in the Pacific Northwest. And once there, everyone knew that Eugene would spend at least a few hours in various Seattle coffee shops chatting with environmentally conscious hipsters about global warming. Before leaving for Seattle, Eugene had emailed his colleagues in the scientific community about the pending Department of Energy review of cold fusion, and he urged them to make the potential role for cold fusion a key issue in the 2004 presidential campaign that was now underway. It was clear Eugene wanted to rattle a few cages amongst the cold fusion skeptics. After returning a few days later from Seattle, all Eugene really wanted to do was dive right back into his cold fusion research. But before he could do that, he knew he had to head back down to Connecticut and prep the family property so it could be rented out again. So, bright and early on Friday, May 14th, 2004, Eugene put on his khaki work pants and white t-shirt. He hopped into his Dodge Caravan, decorated with cold fusion decals, and made the 2.5-hour drive south to begin the big cleanup. Eugene liked physical work, and he was actually looking forward to getting the property back in shape. The mediation/eviction process had been quite stressful, and it had cost him some money, but in the end, both he and the Andersons had actually parted on good terms. When Eugene arrived at 119 Salem Turnpike, he felt a familiar sense of affection for the place where he had grown up. The house was set close to the road, and the road was now a lot busier since he was a kid. And then as he kind of looked around, he felt a little pang of regret that so many of the houses on the block that he had grown up with had given way to fast food restaurants and shabby strip malls. There were some big trees on the Malov property, and their driveway extended from Salem Turnpike straight back to a detached 2-car garage and back. Once in the backyard, the house itself blocked the view of the street and muffled the sound of traffic. It was actually one of the property's best selling points, that the backyard felt much more private than the location of the house suggested. Eugene turned his car into the driveway and drove down it until he came to a stop right in front of a big green dumpster that he had rented that was positioned right outside of the garage. After getting out of his car, Eugene walked over to the back door of the house, he unlocked it, and went inside to use the first-floor bathroom. Afterwards, he went back outside, tossed his empty coffee cup into the dumpster, and then he made his way into the detached garage to start clearing it out. Over the next couple of hours, Eugene threw a lot of the junk in the garage out into the dumpster, he cut the grass, and he got a chance to chat with the next-door neighbors and put out the word that, yes, they were looking for some new tenants. Eventually, Eugene went back inside of the house and began removing some of the random possessions that the Andersons had left behind. By mid-afternoon, Eugene had called his wife, Joanne, to let her know that he was making good progress, but there was still a lot to do, and so he probably would not be back until at least 9 p.m. It was late afternoon when Eugene, who was working in the back of the house by this point, heard a car pull into the driveway. From where he was standing, he couldn't see the car because the house was blocking his view, so he just stopped what he was doing and listened for a second. A second later, Eugene heard 2 car doors open and then slam shut in the driveway. Eugene likely believed these were people who had maybe seen his for rent sign, which was out front, and they were just looking for more information about the property. So Eugene made the short walk from behind the house over to the driveway, and when he turned the corner and looked up the driveway toward this new parked car, he had to squint because the sun was beaming down on his face. As he strained his eyes to see who was there, he made out 2 large men he did not recognize walking toward him. Before Eugene could even ask their names or what they wanted, the 2 men rushed up to him and began kind of muscling him backwards. As they did this, they told Eugene very clearly why they were there, at which point Eugene, who's kind of stumbling backwards, began yelling for them to stop and to just leave, but the 2 men did not leave. Instead, they continued to press and muscle him backwards until Eugene was out of sight of the driveway and the main road. Several hours later, at around 10 p.m., Eugene's wife, Joanne, who was at their home in Pembroke, New Hampshire, 2.5 hours away to the north, received a call from a woman who identified herself as Demetris Granger. The woman was down in Norwich, Connecticut, and while driving along the Salem Turnpike, she'd seen a house with a for rent sign out front, and she called the number, which was Joanne's phone number. She apologized for the late call, but she wanted to know if it was possible to maybe have a look at the property that night. Joanne had not heard from Eugene since their last call several hours earlier, and since he wasn't back yet, she had just assumed he was still at the house working. So she gave Demetris a description of her husband and his vehicle and told her that if Eugene was still there, she was sure he'd be happy to show her around. About 40 minutes later, Demetris arrived outside of 119 Salem Turnpike. She didn't see a Dodge Caravan in the driveway, and so she figured Eugene must have left to go back to New Hampshire. But she decided, since she was there, she would still like to just hop out and maybe get a better look at the outside of the property. So she pulled into the driveway, she parked her car, and she got out and began walking down the driveway toward the back of the house. But after walking only a few steps, she suddenly stopped. Then, with her hands shaking, she pulled out her cell phone and she dialed 911. This podcast is at the Norwich Police Department, just 7 minutes away from the rental property. The night dispatcher answered the emergency call. Demetris told them she was at 119 Salem Turnpike and that she was looking down at the mangled body of a man lying face up in a pool of blood on the driveway. By 11 p.m. that night, Eugene's childhood home was swarming with police and emergency medical personnel. It didn't take long for the 2 lead detectives who arrived on the scene to realize that they were likely dealing with a homicide and a possible robbery. As they approached the victim, they immediately noted that his shoes were gone and his pockets had been pulled inside out. After talking with a terrified Demetris, who had gone back to sit inside of her car, And after dialing the phone number listed on the for rent sign out in the front yard, it also didn't take the detectives very long to identify the victim as Eugene Malov. Joanne Malov, almost speechless with shock, was able to tell detectives that her husband was in Norwich to clean up the family rental property. She told them that she had expected Eugene home in New Hampshire by now, but she had talked with him earlier in the afternoon by phone, and he had told her that there was just a lot of work to do and that he might be much later than he had thought. When police told her that his van was not in the driveway, Joanne suddenly spoke in a rush and said, well, are you sure the body is his? Maybe he already left, and the person you're telling me that's dead, maybe that's not him. But, as gently as they could, the detectives on the phone told Joanne that the man they had found definitely matched her husband's description. Then the Norwich police called the Pembroke, New Hampshire police and asked them to send an officer over to the Malov house to check on Joanne and to gather any information they could about her husband's activities that day. The Norwich police also put out a be on the lookout or BOLO alert for Eugene's car with its distinctive decals and vanity license plate. The crime scene itself was a mess, in part because the yard and driveway were covered with fresh grass clippings as well as litter and debris from the ongoing cleanout of the property. Based on everything they saw, the theory the police came up with was that Eugene had been the victim of a robbery and that after killing him, his attacker had taken Eugene's watch and wallet, removed his shoes, and then fled in Eugene's van. Early the next morning, Norwich police got a call from a patrol officer saying he'd discovered Eugene's Dodge Caravan in a commuter parking lot at the Foxwoods Resort and Casino, located 15 minutes away from the site of the murder. A forensic examination of the vehicle showed no signs of any fingerprints on the steering wheel or on the car door handles. The engine and exhaust pipe were cool to the touch when the car was found, so police knew it had not been driven recently and was probably left there immediately after the murder. Security cameras at Foxwoods didn't help either. The night had been cloudy, damp, and hazy, and there was no footage that showed the vehicle or its driver entering the lot or parking the van. The only time frame that the police could come up with for the killing was that it must have happened between early afternoon, when Eugene called Joanne, and 8:30 p.m., which was when a neighbor had noticed that the Dodge Caravan was no longer parked in the driveway. Within 24 hours of the murder, the news that a prominent MIT scientist and cold fusion advocate had been found dead was making local and national headlines. And it didn't take long before the brutal but straightforward robbery-homicide theory got a lot more complicated. Even as police in New Hampshire interviewed Joanne Malov and her 2 children, and police in Norwich started tracking down other persons of interest like the Malovs' former tenants, the science community that studied nuclear and cold fusion, as well as other potentially significant alternatives to fossil fuels, began buzzing with rumors and speculation. And the lead detectives on the Malov case were about to get swept up into a high-stakes world of scientific research and intrigue. As police started interviewing Eugene's colleagues and co-workers, his closest friends in the scientific community hinted to police that not everyone would have wanted Eugene to succeed in his quest to discover the secret of cold fusion and a potentially unlimited source of cheap energy. And based on those rumors, and the fact that Eugene's vehicle had been found several miles away with no fingerprints on it anywhere, people began to speculate that this could have been a professional hit or maybe a revenge killing. And these speculations quickly began to appear in the media, with headlines like, "Were those with financial stakes in the big gas and oil companies trying to stop cold fusion research?" Meanwhile, police interviews with the Malov family quickly confirmed that no one in the family had either the motive or opportunity to kill Eugene. But when Joanne told police about the eviction proceedings against Roy and Patricia Anderson that Eugene had been directly involved in, police quickly turned their attention to tracking the former tenants down. Almost immediately, they got a tip from a neighbor who had been friendly with the Andersons that led police to the Andersons' 26-year-old son, Chad Schaefer, who had lived in the house on 119 Salem Turnpike with his parents. And Chad, who was totally shocked at the news of Eugene being found dead, would tell police that he was not directly involved in the eviction proceedings. That was something that Eugene and his parents handled. But his impression was that his parents and Eugene had ended things on relatively good terms. When asked, Chad told police that he had been at his apartment with his girlfriend and newborn baby on the day of the murder. As for his parents, he didn't know for sure where they had been on the day of the murder, but he believed with relative certainty that they had been at their new house in Montville, Connecticut. So police would go to Roy and Patricia's house in Montville, and the couple would be just as shocked by the news about Eugene as their son was, and they would say they were home on the day that Eugene was killed. And when asked about the eviction, Roy and Patricia's story would match their son's. They said that they had not been happy about being evicted, obviously, but ultimately they had managed to end things on fairly good terms with Eugene and his family. And so after the police left the couple's home, they realized that they had no leads. Everything had turned into a dead end. Everyone had an alibi and no one knew what happened. But soon, the police would catch a huge break, or so they thought. Within days of Eugene's body being discovered, the police actually arrested 2 men for the murder. The men had been on a drug-fueled burglary spree in the Norwich, Connecticut area at the same time that Eugene was killed, and so they seemed like the perfect suspects. But after being held in jail for 4 years, it would turn out the state's forensic lab had actually mishandled a key piece of evidence, falsely linking the 2 burglars to the homicide. While the 2 men would go on to be tried in court for their burglary spree, the state had no choice but to drop the murder charges against them and apologize. But that mistake was much more than just embarrassing for law enforcement. It meant that for the last 4 years that they were focused on the wrong suspects, the police had done nothing for Eugene's murder. They had not investigated anything else. They believed they had their suspects. And so now Eugene's murder was just a cold case. But in November of 2008, which was right after the 2 wrong suspects were released, the state of Connecticut formed a special cold case task force of state and local law enforcement personnel that began aggressively reinvestigating Eugene's murder. 3 months later, they held a press conference announcing that they were now offering a $50,000 reward to anyone from the public who came forward with information that would lead to Eugene's killer. While the task force declined to give any details about their new investigation, Detective Jim Curtis told reporters that during their first 3 months on the case, they had already come up with at least one very promising lead. The news of the possible lead and the $50,000 reward electrified the scientific community. Even researchers and scientists who had disagreed with Eugene about cold fusion had soon realized that his death had left a huge void inside the field of new energy research. And Eugene's friends and his staff at Infinite Energy, who had managed to keep Eugene's publication afloat even after his death, had not only missed him and his brilliant mind, but they also just wanted answers. Who killed Eugene and why? The big new lead that Detective Curtis had referred to during the press conference related to a particular set of keys. On the night of May 14th, 2004, which was the night Eugene was found, the police would immediately notice that the entire property was covered in grass clippings from when Eugene had cut the grass earlier. There were clippings still clumped up on the grass. The clippings were out on the driveway. They had blown into the garage and out into the street in front. And all the litter and debris that was scattered around the property from the clean out of the house, that too was covered in grass clippings. But there was a set of keys that had a distinctive plastic tag attached to them that had a picture of the sun on it, as well as the name Brittany on the keychain, that were found near Eugene's body, but these keys did not have a single blade of grass on them. Instead, it looked like they were dropped on top of some loose clippings, meaning they had to have been dropped later in the night, well after Eugene had cut the grass. And so maybe these keys were not Eugene's. Maybe they were the killer's keys, and they had accidentally dropped them during the attack. But despite this very promising lead, the police got nowhere with it. Then, roughly 1 year later, in May 2009, a mother of 3 young children, enticed by the $50,000 reward, walked into the Norwich Police Department and announced that she had information about the Eugene Mallove case. The story she would tell police would not only lead them to discover who owned those distinctive keys, but also her story would completely break the murder case wide open, and it would turn out Eugene's murder had nothing to do with cold fusion. Based on what this woman said and the subsequent police investigation, here is a reconstruction of what really happened to Eugene Mallove on the evening of May 14th, 2004. On the morning of May 14th, 2004, Eugene packed his dark green Dodge Caravan with folded up moving boxes and bags of rags and cleaning supplies, and then he headed south from his home in Pembroke, New Hampshire, to his childhood home 2.5 hours south in Norwich, Connecticut. He wished now that he had made more in-person visits to the property since renting it out a year ago to the Andersons, because not only had the Anderson family stopped paying rent, but they had also stopped treating the property with any respect. When they finally moved out after the mediation and the eviction, the place had become a total eyesore in the neighborhood. At one point, there were 2 non-working cars on the front lawn, and even though the Andersons did remove them when they left, they did not remove all the remaining extra car parts and bike parts that were all over the lawn, and there was just lots of trash and other debris basically strewn across the entire property. And to top it all off, Eugene would learn that the Andersons had been subletting out the basement of the house to help pay their $1,000 a month rent, which had resulted in a steady stream of kind of sketchy people coming in and out of the house that also did not treat the property with respect. And so when Eugene arrived at the house that morning, his plan was just to go in there and throw away anything the Andersons had left behind. After parking in the driveway in front of the dumpster, Eugene took a quick bathroom break inside of the house before going back outside into the garage to start throwing away whatever was inside of there. Over the next couple of hours, as he did this, he periodically glanced out the front doors of the garage up the driveway to Salem Turnpike, where he could see the curious glances from pedestrians and drivers, some of whom slowed down as they passed by the house to see what he was doing. Eugene likely didn't think much of them and just kept doing this big clean-out. However, what Eugene didn't realize was that one of those passerbys was a relative of the Andersons, and they didn't really know the full picture of what was going on. And so when they saw Eugene throwing away all of the Andersons' stuff, the relative pulled out her cell phone and called Patricia and Roy Anderson to tell them what was going on. A few minutes later, as Eugene was peacefully going about his work, across town at an apartment on Chestnut Street, Patricia and Roy's son, 26-year-old Chad Schaefer, and his 24-year-old girlfriend, Candace, heard Chad's phone ringing. He picked it up, but before he could even say hello, he heard his mother's angry voice. She had just gotten the word from that relative that Eugene was at their old rental throwing out the Andersons' belongings, and she was furious. She had been telling Chad for weeks to get over there and clean out the rest of their stuff, but clearly he had not done that. And so now she demanded that her son get over there and take care of this situation. Chad initially did not do anything. But as he sat there, he started to think about what he might have accidentally left behind at the property that now might get thrown away. And so eventually he decided he would head over and talk to Eugene. But before he headed over there, he decided he needed help from his cousin, 31-year-old Mizelle Brown, who was well known to Norwich police and who had a past history of drug offenses. Mizelle arrived out front of the Chestnut Street apartment late that afternoon. On his way out the door of his apartment to go out and meet Mizelle out on the road, Chad grabbed his own set of car keys from a hook and stuffed them into his jacket pocket. A few minutes later, the 2 men were in Mizelle's car, driving over to 119 Salem Turnpike. Once they arrived at the house, they turned into the driveway and they parked behind Eugene's van. As the 2 big men got out of the car and slammed their car doors shut, they saw Eugene step out from behind the back of the house into the driveway, and he was kind of shielding his eyes with his hands, and his face showed no sign that he recognized either of them. The two men wasted no time and walked right up to Eugene and began crowding into his personal space, kind of forcing him to start stepping backwards. But despite how intimidating this was for Eugene, when Mizelle and Chad told him who they were and that he had to stop throwing their stuff out right now, Eugene was immediately defiant and said, "No, you had your chance to claim your stuff, you didn't, now leave." But instead of leaving, Chad stepped forward and threw the first punch in what would become a violent struggle that left Eugene's blood spattered on the side of his childhood home, on the garden hose lying across the backyard, on the doors of the cars parked in the driveway, and on the side of the green dumpster. When Eugene finally fell to the ground face first, Chad and Mizelle took turns beating him literally into the ground with a metal pipe they found on the floor of the garage. Eventually, the two men stopped and just stood there in silence, sweating and breathing heavily while they stared down at the horrible damage they had inflicted on Eugene. Then, almost like snapping back to reality, the two men looked around them to see if anyone had seen them. But when they looked around, it was quiet, and they noticed that where Eugene had fallen, his body was kind of blocked from view by the dumpster and his van and their car, and so no one could even see him, even if they were looking in their direction. And so the two men, satisfied they were in the clear and that they would not get caught, they just casually hopped back into their car, they backed out of the driveway, and they drove back to the apartment on Chestnut Street. When Chad and Mizelle walked through the front door, Chad's girlfriend, Candace, immediately saw their clothes were covered in blood. But before she could absorb what the two men told her, that they had, quote, beat the shit out of their landlord, the two men told Candace that she now had to come with them and help them make their murder look like a robbery. Candace put her newborn baby in the crib, and then she, Chad, and Mizelle left the apartment and returned to 119 Salem Turnpike. But when they got there and they parked in the driveway and approached Eugene's body, Chad and Mizelle were stunned to find that Eugene was still alive. He was still breathing. When they rolled him over, Eugene opened his eyes and looked up at his attackers and began pleading with them to help him as the blood began to spill out of his mouth. As Candace started to back away, Mizelle reached out and caught her by the arm and dragged her back to Eugene's body. And Chad pushed the metal pipe they had used earlier to beat Eugene into Candace's hands. And then Chad pointed at Eugene and said, "Hit him." When she didn't respond, Chad slapped her and said if she didn't do as he told her, they'd kill her too. And so Candace gripped the pipe, she raised it over her head, and as she did this, Eugene begged them to stop. But seconds later, that pipe came crashing down directly onto his face. After she hit him, she handed the pipe back to her boyfriend, and then Chad and Mizelle began taking turns smashing and kicking Eugene's face and body until they were so tired they had to stop. By the end of the second beating, Eugene would have 32 significant lacerations on his face and neck and a stab wound on his right forearm. But amazingly, at the end of this second beating, Eugene was actually not dead yet. And so with no more energy to use the metal pipe or to kick him, Mizelle Brown, who was a very big guy, just stepped directly onto the front of Eugene's throat and shifted all of his weight to that foot and began digging it into his neck. He would stand there grinding his foot left and right into the scientist's throat, breaking bone and cartilage until finally Eugene stopped squirming and died. After Mizelle climbed off of Eugene's neck, the trio staged the scene to look like a robbery, taking Eugene's wallet, wedding band, watch, and digital camera. Then the men gave the keys to Eugene's van to Candace and told her to drive the van to the parking lot at Foxwoods Casino, where Chad's stepfather worked, and to make sure she wiped any of her fingerprints off of the car steering wheel and door handles. Later that night, after Chad and Mizelle picked Candace up at Foxwoods, the three would go back to the Chestnut Street apartment. Before Mizelle left, all three of them stripped off their bloody clothes, which Candace bundled into a laundry basket for washing later. Candace stuffed the items they had stolen from Eugene into a box that she shoved into the back of a closet and then later burned. When Norwich police arrived at the Chestnut Street apartment the day after the murder to question Chad about his possible involvement in Eugene's murder, Chad and Candace gave each other alibis, and Chad was highly cooperative, giving police the address of his mom and stepdad. It wouldn't be until later that day that Chad would realize he had dropped his car keys at the scene of the crime. Those were the distinctive keys with the plastic tag and the name Brittany on the keychain that the cold case task force had zeroed in on for not having grass clippings on them. The name Brittany was the name of Chad's daughter from an earlier relationship with an ex-girlfriend. In 2009, when billboards went up around Norwich advertising a $50,000 reward for any information that led to Eugene Mallof's killer, Candace's good friend, Jill Sebastian, suddenly felt inclined to talk. So she was the woman who had gone into the Norwich police station and said she had information about the murder. It would turn out Jill had seen that bundle of bloody clothes at Candace's apartment around the time of the murder. Not only would Jill's boyfriend, Keyshawn Delavan, confirm Jill's story, but he also told police that he had personally heard Chad and Moselle boast about beating the Andersons' ex-landlord to death. The couple also told police that Chad and Moselle had been selling crack cocaine out of the Malov rental property, and that when they heard that Eugene was doing a clean-out, they started to worry that he might find some of those drugs in the garage. And so when they went over there, they really needed Eugene to stop. Once police brought Candace in for questioning and offered her a plea deal in exchange for her cooperation, Candace would identify the keys found at the crime scene as belonging to Chad. She also described Moselle's involvement, as well as the role she herself had played in the murder. After being entered into the witness protection program along with Jill and Keyshawn, Candace agreed to testify against Chad and Moselle. In 2008, 4 years after Eugene's death, the Malov family house at 119 Salem Turnpike in Norwich, Connecticut, was torn to the ground. 4 years after that, on April 20th, 2012, Chad Schaefer pled guilty to first-degree manslaughter and accessory to third-degree robbery and was sentenced to 16 years in prison. 2.5 years after that, on October 24th, 2014, Moselle Brown was sentenced to 58 years in prison. And about 7 months after that, on May 27th, 2015, Candace Foster, who served 4 years and 10 months in prison while awaiting trial, pled guilty to hindering prosecution and tampering with evidence and was sentenced to 5 years probation. Back in December of 2004, 7 months after Eugene was killed, the Department of Energy would finally release its report on their review of cold fusion research. While they stopped short of endorsing cold fusion as a viable energy source, they did recommend that funding agencies should entertain individual, well-designed proposals for experiments involving cold fusion. According to a close colleague of Eugene Mallov, while the report certainly fell short of what Eugene expected, the colleague believes Eugene still would have welcomed even the smallest steps along a new scientific path into the future.
Here's the sentence rewritten in proper American English. Thank you for listening to the exclusive episode of the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and are looking for more thrilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. Simply search for MrBallen podcast episode wherever you get your podcasts, and you'll find them all. Additionally, there are hundreds of other stories like the ones you heard today, available in video format on our YouTube channel called MrBallen Podcast Episode. I truly appreciate your support. Until next time, take care.